Thanks for having me, guys. Good to see you all again, most of you, and some of the new faces. I've got some startup background, worked for two venture-backed tech startups. One was a fintech startup out in New York. The other was like a social media company that failed miserably. We raised $5 million and crashed in 2 years. Learned a lot about what not to do there. I've woven my experiences with those two startups into this quick primer that I'm going to give you. And I've also launched a couple of nonprofits. One was called Startup Genome, where we actually researched what makes startups successful. We looked at the DNA of founders, and we looked at how startup ecosystems at geography level work. And we publish reports, and we advise big governments on how to change economic or entrepreneurship or policy to encourage entrepreneurship activity and small business success. And then for the past 5 years before taking this role here at Tech Launch at the university, been helping corporations launch projects. And they screw everything up in all the same ways that startups do. But when they screw something up, they don't get fired. They don't lose, they move on to the next thing. So the stakes are much higher in the startup capacity. So what I thought I would do with y'all, and I know some of this stuff's gonna be a little bit redundant if you've been through an I-Corps program the past 2 times, but I always give this presentation differently. And you know, whoever I'm giving this primer to, depending on the stage they're in, always asks different questions. So even if I go over a couple of things you've seen before, it might be freshly relevant to you based on where you're at and how far you've come since the last time you've talked with me. So I encourage you to pay attention, right? Look at the materials if it's new. Consider maybe what you ignored last time or didn't get around to doing. Maybe you'll get some new value out of this. Also, let's make it very interactive, right? So feel free to interrupt me and say, that doesn't make any sense, Shane. That doesn't work for our customer, for our market. How do you expect me to do this? Where's the value in that? So that doesn't make sense, Shane. Why would I do that? Where's the value? I'm not going to waste my time. I got 500,000 other things to do because I'm a startup. So please challenge me. And I'm going to try to fly through like a couple of concepts. And again, please interrupt me, but I'm going to try to fly through some things. And then we could just talk, because I think the best thing we might be able to do with the time we have here is to spend a little time with a handful of you. We can talk about maybe what you are doing in terms of customer discovery, what you're doing to try to better understand your customers. We can get specific. I could tell you maybe some tips on how to improve that. And then the rest of you can watch. We can do that with a few of you if we have time, and that might be the most valuable thing. Does that sound good to you all? Did you have any expectations about, okay. You have any expectations about what to get out of this today?
This is Bruce. I'm hoping to learn how to capture the information that you get from your customer exploration and all that.
Sure. Yeah, we can talk about that. I have that in here somewhere, but you know, just to give you a quick answer, you know, physically capturing the information is one thing, but then what you do with it is another thing, right? So right. I try to record every meeting, like record the audio.
Okay. And
I then transcribe that audio. I pay a third-party service to transcribe it, and then I read the transcription, because there is a cognitive bias that I will introduce you to that basically prevents you from hearing everything your customer says during that conversation. You're not going to absorb it all. And so it's very valuable just to look at it a second time. It's equally important before you go into the meeting to have some kind of predictions on what you expect to hear so you can compare it. If you just go in, take notes, and then you're looking at your notes, it's not always clear what to do with it, right? So I do have a tool that I can show you real quick. I think it's in this. It's called the learning board. Here it is. This is a worksheet. So on the left side, you before going into each interview with the customer, you fill the left side out. What do you want to learn? And then what the second box there, interview or experiment, that's basically your script. These are the questions you're going to ask. So what do you want to learn? What questions are you going to ask? And what do you predict you'll hear? It's very helpful then to pull this up afterwards, because it forces you to kind of consider what you learned and then make a real decision on it. It's even more important if you're trying to talk with your teammates to make a decision, if they weren't in the interview, because you can start arguing if they didn't hear the same thing. You want to avoid arguing. You want to make this really data-driven.
Right.
So if you agree with your partner or your team on what you want to learn, what you're going to ask, who you're talking to, what you expect, and then you come back and you fill this out and talk about it as a group, much more likely to be able to make decisions quickly rather than like continue to just argue and debate on stuff. So then you write, what did we actually hear? What's our decision? And what are we going to do next? What's the next thing we want to learn? One key thing I didn't mention here is at the bottom of this third box on the left here. This is deciding in advance what you will do based on what you hear. So if you don't, let's say you make a learning board and you want to learn something and you go talk to, you say, okay, team, we're going to go talk to 20 people. You could say, all right, if a majority doesn't strongly say this thing or bring this problem up without being directly asked about it, then we're going to deprioritize it on our product roadmap, something like that. But you pick a number in advance. That way you're not going, well, I think that was good enough. And the other person says, well, I didn't think that was strong enough. And then it's this subjective debate. It's awkward.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. Excellent.
So feel free to please, let's just, interrupt me anytime. In a startup world, maybe I can make this bigger, right? Isn't there like a enter full screen? Yeah, you guys see that full screen now?
Yes.
Great. So in a startup world or in launching a new project or even just a new feature at your startup, some terrible situations happen. Sometimes you build stuff, you never launch it. Sometimes you make something and you launch it, but nobody buys it. Sometimes you launch it, people start buying it, and then it falls off a cliff. And this is very common. That's what happens to most corporate innovation projects. Because there's usually people are held accountable to launch something, but they rush it. They don't understand their customers deeply enough. They're not compensated on how it, or incentivized on how it actually performs. They just have to launch something. So it fails. This is very wasteful. And like I mentioned earlier, in a corporate environment, it's fine. You don't get fired. You get promoted sometimes. You move into a different position. You go to the next project. But in a startup world, you die. And so those situations are very, very wasteful. Right? We want to avoid this kind of waste. And the way to avoid this kind of waste, Google says it really well. They believe that they should kill things as soon as they can because it's wasteful to keep working on stuff that's obviously not going to work. And you want to practice that in your startup too. You guys may have heard like this methodology called the lean startup, or just customer discovery in general. Really, there's just one goal. It's very simple. It's to build something that people will use, something that solves their problem, and to do that in a very efficient way, minimizing risk, minimizing waste. This is the way companies used to launch back in the dot-com days and before, and this is how a lot of corporations still launch projects, and unfortunately how a lot of startups still launch projects. They have a brilliant idea, and they spend a ton of time in a vacuum in their basement, not talking to anybody in the world, not talking to the people that they're eventually going to sell this to, making all kinds of decisions about how to design their product, how to engineer it, how to market it, and then they have a launch date in the future. The problem with this approach is that each decision you're making represents a little bit of risk because you might be wrong. Even if you have a ton of industry knowledge, even if it's your 10th company, you might be wrong. And there might be a 1% chance you're wrong, and it might not be very significant, but some of the decisions might carry a lot of risk, 20, 30, 40%. You might be making assumptions along the way. And maybe the assumptions are based on your personal experience. And it's not true for some other people in the world. No matter what, your opinion is biased. So when you get out to that launch day, the sum of all those decisions builds up. All that risk builds up. You launch it, and then you find out what you were wrong about. And then you have to backpedal and try to fix things. And in a startup environment, that could mean death. The better way to do it is every time you're faced with a decision, you take a guess and you do the smallest thing you can. And that could be talking to somebody, or it could mean building a very simple prototype, or it could be running some sort of experiment to prove it out before you go build out the whole thing. And you test it with real people. And you basically de-risk that decision. You find out if you're right or wrong. Then you move on to the next thing. So you're basically building your company in the market and always exposing your mind and your product in your company to real customers constantly. You're de-risking along the way. And if you take this path, you end up at the same time period with this launch date in a much better position. In fact, you've already launched. You've had multiple launches. You're much more likely to arrive on a product that truly solves a problem for people in a very impactful way. It's 10 times better than what's out there. I'm going to skip over slides from time to time so we can power through things. If you do this approach, it's painful because, as smart people, we think we know the answers, and we try to be smart. We try to make really good decisions. But that's really not the path to success unless you're a genius. And you have perfect information in the world, and you know all the future things that might change about the world and all the variables that might come at you. So what you have to do is you just have to make decisions as fast as possible and then test them and find out which ones you're right about. So what you're trying to optimize here is learning, not necessarily growth, revenue, all these other pirate vanity metrics. It's just learning. You're trying to learn as much as possible. And it can be painful because you're going to be wrong a lot. So you got to get comfortable being very wrong frequently. And if you can get good at being wrong a lot, that means you're learning and you're testing and you're growing. And that is the ingredient of what I think is a successful entrepreneur. I'm going to give you a couple of things in your brain that will prevent you from being awesome as an entrepreneur. One is a cognitive error called fundamental attribution bias. And this photo represents a clear example of it. You're in traffic, you get cut off, and you think the person that cut you off is the worst person in the world. You want to murder them, right? Because they cut you off. But what you're doing is you're making an assumption about who they are as a person, about their disposition, not the situation they were in. The situation they were in might have dictated cutting you off. Maybe they just got cut off and they were trying to avoid an accident. Maybe they're having a heart attack and they're trying to get over to the shoulder. You don't know their situation, but you're making assumptions about who they are as a person. Now, if you're doing this with your customer, you could be on a bad path. If you're making assumptions, or really if you're even defining your customer based on their identity and their disposition. It's better to look at their situation, the situation they're in, where they need your product to solve a problem. It doesn't even matter necessarily who they think they are as a person. Amazon almost made this mistake, or they did make this mistake in the beginning of launching the Kindle. They marketed it to people who loved reading, to avid readers. And everybody hated it because they love their books. They love their physical books. But they got some early adopters despite that. And they went and looked at these early adopters. And it was people who were traveling frequently. It was consultants jumping on flights once a week. They couldn't bring all these physical books with them. Now, people who considered themselves, avid readers and they loved books, who were rejecting the Kindle at first, sometimes their situation would change. They'd get a new job and they'd have to fly more often or travel. Suddenly they'd buy a Kindle, even though they were rejecting a Kindle before. Now their identity didn't change. They're still somebody who loves reading. It was their situation that changed that made them become a Kindle customer. Do you see the difference there between disposition and situation? So try to define your customer. I know some of you are already doing this really well, but some of you might be able to improve. In fact, some of you, when you were giving your 1 minute pitch or your 1 second pitch earlier, I didn't even know who your customer was. You didn't even mention it. You just mentioned the technology, and I'm wondering if you You probably have like 20 different customer types you think you're going to try to sell this to. We need to narrow that down. We need to make sure that we're selling into people who are in a situation where they're experiencing pain and they have a problem and you can solve it. And it would actually really help you prioritize all your different customer segments by looking at the different situations these people are in and how painful the problem is for them in that situation. And that might help you figure out what your beachhead market is, who your early adopters are going to be. Because if you look at almost any successful startup, starting small, focusing on a niche, focusing on the people who are experiencing the most pain is the path to eventually dominating the world and winning big, not going after all types of possible customers from the beginning, which dilutes your message. And also it forces you, it prevents you from learning deeply about your early adopters and about people and the situations they're in if you're trying to go after everybody at once. Another cognitive error, another thing that we do to ourselves that prevents us from, somebody gonna ask a question? Okay, so another problem with in our brains that prevents us from being awesome as entrepreneurs is just not being able to pay attention to everything. We miss stuff and we don't realize just how much we miss. It's called inattentional blindness. We think we see and notice more than we really do. And doing customer interviews is the best way, at least in these early stages of your company, to prevent inattentional blindness from killing you. You know, a lot of startups fail from, they don't see something coming. And so if you can see more, you can plan for those things. And one way I mentioned earlier to do that is to record conversations and reread those transcriptions to see the things you didn't hear. Another thing is to do these interviews in pairs, or if you're a single founder, to have a partner in crime, have a co-founder. They're going to see things you don't have, or see things you don't see. And actively trying to prove yourself wrong. And this is hard to do. We tend as humans to only look at information that justifies what we already believe. And this is why our democracy is falling apart right now. But if you can go out and try your best to look at the weird stuff that doesn't seem right to you, prove yourself wrong, and understand that information, you're going to just see more stuff.
What do you mean?
So give me an example.
Weird stuff. What do you mean by weird stuff? I'm sorry. Let me. Yeah,
stuff that's just that contradicts your worldview. So maybe you think your customers are a certain way. So go try to prove to yourself that they aren't that way.
Play your video, Shane. That's pretty telling.
This one?
Yeah, that's the one.
This is a PDF. I'm actually showing I don't have the link handy. But I can just explain it to you. You watch a quick 1-minute video of people playing basketball. There's 2 teams. There's 3 people wearing a white shirt, 3 people wearing a black shirt. And there's a prompt that comes on that says, count how many times the team in white passes the ball. And you watch the video and your eyes are focused on the team in white and you're counting the number of passes. And then at the end of the video, it says, how many times did the team in white pass the ball? And everybody says, oh, 15, 16. And then it's like, great, you're right, or maybe you're wrong a little bit, but did you see the giant bear walk across the screen and do the moonwalk? And then you watch the video again, and there's a guy in a bear costume walking across the screen that most people don't see when they watch the video. So there might be things that you're not seeing. And the way to find things, like maybe things about the market, yeah?
If I may add, it sounds crazy, but I did that actually. One of our psychology interns did that to me one time, long time ago. And I literally did not see this giant bear. So if it sounds far-fetched, I don't think it is. I did not see the giant bear. So
I'll give you an example from one of the startups that I was involved. I mentioned that social media startup that failed miserably. And this was one of the reasons we failed miserably. The startup was called Cohort. And it was like a group management platform. We were trying to be a better version of like meetup.com or Facebook groups. Our hypothesis was if you're managing a group, it's really hard and you have to use like 10 different tools. You've got your link, you've got your like membership roster, your MailChimp to send emails. If you collect dues, you've got a financial tool. So it was a mess. And we wanted to build a better online group platform. And we built it, and it's amazing. And then we went to a bunch of people we know who run meetup groups. And we said, hey, let's bring your group over. And they wouldn't. They wouldn't, as it turns out, because on that meetup.com page, it shows how many members you have. And that's an impressive number. And they don't want that number to decrease. And if they have 1,000 members, that's a big, important number. And they were worried that when they switched, not everybody would make the migration. In fact, they knew that some of their members weren't very active. And they were worried about losing like 50, 60, 80% of their members. We could have learned that in advance. We didn't see it coming. We could have learned that. We could have interviewed people. Hey, last time you adopted a new technology, last time have you ever in the past switched your group from one platform to another? What happened? How did it go? Maybe we would have learned some of this. We could have actually tried to get people to switch to a different platform without building any software, just to see if people would switch. We didn't consider switching costs. We didn't think about it. We didn't see it coming. We could have learned about it in advance. Just by understanding situations where people were in, where they were unhappy with the product they had and what they tried to do and how that went. Maybe we would have discovered that we would have seen it coming. So, what are you not seeing? What are the assumptions you're making that could kill you? Things like, will people actively look for and find your solution when they have the problem? Sometimes people have a problem and they just deal with it. They don't go looking for solutions. It's not a very big problem. And that's a big flag for you. When people have the problem that you're going to solve for them, they need to then go out and look for it in the world, and you need to be there, wherever that is, with your marketing. Maybe people already have to understand something or own something. Maybe they'll use it in a different way than you expect, and that could have big implications. Will they keep using it over time? There's technical decisions that you might be making about how the product will be built. So what I encourage you guys to do, how are we doing on time? We're done at 1:30, right?
Yeah.
Okay. What I encourage you guys to do is brainstorm with your team all of the things that you are assuming about your customer, about your market, about your product. And some of these things are going to be very obvious things, right? So like with Vinod, with Vino, what has to be true? Well, dental practices have to have no-shows. Those no-shows have to happen with some frequency that it matters to them, that they lose money. Ideally, for somebody to adopt consultation, or whatever the new name of your company is, they have hopefully already tried at least one or two things to solve no-shows. Maybe people that you're trying to reach have to be reachable. So they have to be, they have to have a smartphone. That's a dumb one, but that could not be true in some geographical markets. They have to respond to text messages. Is it true that a dental practice has to have someone working the desk? There's a bunch of stuff. Some of these things are obvious. Some of them might be less obvious that have to be true for your startup to work. I encourage you to brainstorm them all. It's actually a really good exercise, by the way, just a really good psychological exercise to do this, because what you're doing is you're just kind of getting all the things you're worried about out onto the table to discuss with your team. So I recommend maybe doing it alone first, getting them all. What are the things you're concerned about? What are the things that have to be true? Get them all out, then show them to each other amongst your team, and then put them in prioritization order on how worried you guys are about it. And then we can go make sure you're right about them very quickly by doing some interviews or maybe doing some experiments. Sometimes things like this can fester inside of a startup, and they're unspoken and they're poisonous. And if you don't deal with them at the early stage of the startup, it can be too late. So let me fast forward a little bit here and give you 2 examples of how I go do these interviews. By the way, I'll share this slide deck with Anita. She can send it out to the group. So there's 2 styles of interviews I like to do. One's called meandering approach, and this is where you're still like you don't know enough about your customers yet. You really just want to like poke around and understand who they are and the problem that they have and what it means to them, what they do when they have that problem. So this is a very simple one where you just get people to tell you a story. So you craft an opening statement that gets them to tell you a story. So, hey, tell me about the last time you tried to reduce no-shows, or tell me about the last time you tried to address, blackouts in your city. Maybe that one's a bit too broad. Maybe you need to narrow that question down a little bit. Like, tell me about the last time you tried to address, intersection accidents. I don't know. The questions need to be specific enough that they tell you stories that you care about, but not too broad that they don't start telling you stories that have nothing to do with what you're doing. So you're gonna take a guess, throw this prompt at people, and then you can keep refining this question until it gets until you start hearing the stories you want to hear.
This is Bruce. I just I like that approach of prompting them to tell a story versus a lot of times I'll say, well, how do you do this today?
Yeah, that might be leading. It might be a little bit leading, especially if you're getting really specific.
Yeah.
What you really want to do in an ideal world, I know you guys are a little bit farther along with your startups, but in an ideal world, you never even bring up the problem. They bring it up. And you start with an opening question that's a little bit broader than the actual problem.
Okay.
And they bring it up because then it's important and it's critical to them. So maybe like Vino could walk into a dentist practice and say, hey, what are you doing to fill your calendar? Or tell me about the last time you, tried to decrease costs. You don't even bring up no-shows. And if they tell you a story about no-shows, holy shit, like you didn't even mention it and they brought it up because it's on their mind. And you need to be solving problems that are on people's minds.
Yeah.
If it's not on their mind, they're not trying to solve it, they're not thinking about it, they don't care, they have other problems that are more important. So try to craft a prompt here, an opening prompt that's a little bit more generic. Now, you don't want to walk into a dental's office and say, hey, tell me the last time you implemented a new technology at your dental practice. They might start telling you about medical stuff in the actual lab, or I don't understand medical stuff. So the words I'm saying don't make sense, but that might be way too broad. And they might start telling you about billing software or who knows. Maybe that is relevant. I don't know, but so this is one approach. And after they start telling you a story, which is great too, because people love telling stories, they just start talking at you. And your goal with these interviews is to talk as little as possible. This is not a sales pitch meeting, certainly. You want to show up at these interviews as the curious person who just wants to learn. When I reach out to people to book these interviews, I say, hey, I'm just trying to learn as much as I can about this problem or this market. I'm doing a research project. Sometimes I'll say I'm starting a company or launching a project to try to understand this or solve this. Can I just learn about what that means to you? Can I just get 30 minutes of your time and so I book it. And sometimes, hopefully when I get on the call, I control that. And I say, it's so great for the time, really appreciate it. Hey, look, I want to respect your time. If you don't mind, can you just tell me about the last time? Like, I just dive right into it. And if they try to say, well, hold on, like, what are you doing? I might give them a one-liner, but not a one-liner pitch for the startup. I might say, well, we think we might have some ideas for how to solve or how to help dentists fill their calendars more, or we're trying to figure out a new software to help dental practices, but we're not really sure about much yet. Can you tell me about the lab? And you just go right back to that question. So you just give them like almost a bullshit answer and redirect it right back into the interview and get them to talk as much as possible. And then there's some follow-up questions on the screen to get the real good stuff. And this is where, when they start telling you something, you might say, well, what was hard about that? Why was that so hard? What'd you do? How did you solve for that? And then how was that solution? Whatever it was you did, not good enough for you. And then you want to look for like words of emotion. You want to look for them. Oh, that was frustrating. It was exciting. Look for those words. Those words, by the way, write them down, because those are the words you want to use in your marketing, in your outreach emails, et cetera, because it's the words that are on their mind. It's the actual feelings they've experienced. If they've tried to solve it on their own, ask to look at those solutions. Maybe they've built spreadsheets. Maybe they've built little makeshift devices to try to solve these problems. Ask to see those. And why is always a great question. You can ask that 4, 5, 6 times. Here's another approach, another style of interview that might work for some of you. It might not work for some of you. It tends to not work when you have really sophisticated customers, or your purchase price is very high and you don't want to look bad, or if you have a really small market of big buyers and you're afraid of burning a relationship by looking like an idiot. But if you're like launching a consumer mass product and you don't care, if you don't plan to ever go back to somebody, you don't worry about burning a lead, this approach works really well. And it can work for sophisticated customers if you can construct a question or an opening statement that you're comfortable saying to somebody. And that's basically what you do, is you say the opposite of what you actually believe, just to get them to start arguing with you. That sounds weird, but what this does is it elicits an emotional response very, very quickly if they care and if they've had this problem and it means something to them. So like we think dentists, don't have a lot of no-shows, or, those shows aren't important enough that they're really not really doing anything about it. And if you say that to a dentist who's had a lot of no-shows and they've thought about it and they've measured the financial impact, or maybe they tried something, they're going to go, well, no, no-shows are a problem for us. We've tried. Let me tell you about the last time we tried. Like, you're wrong about that, man. No-shows, like, we lose $55 every time somebody doesn't show up, and we don't get to book them for 2 months. That hits my bottom line, man. And you go, interesting. Like, tell me more. Like, what have you done about that? And you ask some of the same follow-up questions. But you'll get to see how passionately they disagree with you. And then if your problem is a migraine problem or a headache problem. If it's something they care about and they're motivated to solve, rather than something that they just kind of ignore because they have other more important problems. And let me just redirect before we just kind of wrap it up here so we can just talk. Let me point out that very bottom bullet on this slide. And this is, you all do this. I still do it. It's hard to prevent yourself from doing it. Sometimes it just comes out of your mouth during these interviews. But try your best not to ask hypothetical questions about the future. The answers to those questions can be misleading. And if you're making important decisions about your product, about your marketing, based on those answers, it could be disastrous for your company. Would you use this product if we built it? What would you pay for it if we come back to you and try to sell it to you? Will you change your behavior in this way if suddenly that's a new option for you? You're asking somebody to predict what they will do in the future. And people are not reliable on guessing even what their own behavior will be in the future. It could be the case that you get a lot of positive feedback. Yes, if I had that sounds like a magic product. If I had that, I would totally use it. I would totally buy it. And you feel excited and you go spend all the time. You're like, I feel comfortable. Let's put the money in. Let's put the time in. Let's build this product. You go back to that same person and they may not buy it. They might go, oh, well, yeah, that's awesome. So cool. I'm worried about switching costs, or, now it's not the right time. Like, let me get through this other thing first and then come back later. Because it's not really that important to them. And they were wrong when they told you that information. So be wary of asking questions about the future. Here's the learning board. You're going to get this deck, so I encourage you to just go through the last few slides because it gives you some ideas about how to ask for an interview. There's some tips specifically on how to find them right now when you can't see them in person, where to look for them. There's an interview. I think there's actually an email script on one of these slides that I think really works really well in a pandemic world. And some tips on just like how to make people feel comfortable in interviews. And one more thing, I'm going to stop sharing. One more thing I want to mention before we just talk is, oh, I'm back. Okay. Is an interview might not be the thing you need to do right now. I know I just harped on interviews, but when you do that exercise of writing down all the assumptions you're making and all the things you're worried about and prioritizing them, if something at the top, if you can't figure out a way to learn or validate that top scary assumption by just talking to people, you might need to do something else. It might be time to run an experiment. It might be time to do something like a smoke test or a Wizard of Oz test. Maybe you guys have learned about experimentation from a different speaker. I can certainly send Anita some summaries of quick experiments you can do to test things. And that's where you do something and you put it in front of people and you see how they react. You know, classic example is, you know, Airbnb. Airbnb was a totally different model, and talking to people didn't help them a whole lot. Because even if they'd say, you know, like, because people weren't doing this yet. People weren't renting. I mean, some people were, I'm sure, but people weren't at a high level renting their extra bedroom or staying in people's, like trying to find people's houses to stay in when they were traveling. That wasn't like an existing market. So you couldn't say, well, tell me about the last time you tried to book a hotel in a new city and it was sold out. What'd you do? People were like, well, I just had to pick a different date. There was no other option. So it was a new market that they were launching. So they had to run a lot of experiments in the early days. And they listed their house on Craigslist and tried to rent it to strangers. And they got their friends to do that. And then they built a website, but they built it in 2 days. And it was crap. And it didn't have any e-commerce built into it. Zappos too, Zappos, the shoe company. I love that story. He wasn't sure if people would buy shoes online because he thought people want to try them on. So he built a very, very simple website. He's non-technical, Tony Shea. He built it in a day. It looked like you could buy shoes, but you couldn't. All it did was fill out a form. It'd send Tony an email, and he went down to the supermarket of shoes and he bought shoes at full retail price and he mailed them to people, and he lost a couple bucks each time. But he did it just to prove if people were willing to buy shoes online without trying them on first, because that was an assumption he wasn't sure about. So there's, you know, so I just want to make sure it's clear that based on what you want to learn, an interview might not be the right thing at the time, but it probably is. There's probably a way to learn a bunch of cool stuff that's on your list right now by doing better interviews and doing more interviews. And in fact, this methodology of customer discovery is a thing you just need to take with you for the rest of your startup journey. Even big companies need to be doing this with each decision, each new feature, entering a new market, launching a new marketing campaign. There's things you can do. There's interviews. There's quick experiments you can do to de-risk that so you don't get it wrong.